The heart of the letter of Colossians is in chapter 2, where Paul defines and refutes the Colossian heresy, which was that the Colossian Christians were missing out on the full Christian experience, which could only be had by keeping the laws of Moses and a kind of severe self-discipline. But Paul says, no, all of the fullness of deity is in Messiah, and you have been filled in him. You don't need to supplement your faith with self-made religion, for that is empty. It is of no value. So that's chapter 2. We're going to look in this lecture at how Paul sets the stage for this refutation in chapter 1, and then how he launches into his gospel alternative in chapter 3. So let's start with that thanksgiving in 1:3-8. So Paul's purpose for the Colossian Christians is that they would cling to the pure and simple gospel which they received, that they would not deviate from that gospel. So what he does is he points to the moment of their conversion, the moment when the gospel came to you, the moment when they heard the gospel, when they learned it from Epaphras. He points to that moment of conversion before all these corrupting influences came in. Let's look how he does that in that Thanksgiving. So check it out here in blue. Their faith in Messiah, he says, of this you heard, the gospel which came to you. See how he's just repeating again and again. Since the day you heard it. Well, when was that? Well, that's when you learned of the gospel from Epaphras. He's pointing to that moment of conversion, and he's saying his purpose in doing so is to say, man, stay there, continue in the faith. Do not shift from that faith which you heard. I mean, if I'm going to pick any one verse, which is Paul's thesis statement for Colossians, it would be right here. Don't shift from the gospel which you learned from Epaphras. Let's take a look at that verse really briefly, and then another similar verse in chapter 2. So down in here, it is in 1:23. Continue in the faith, stable and steadfast. Don't shift from the gospel which you heard, which you learned from Epaphras. And then in chapter 2, it says, as you received Jesus, like how are you supposed to live out the Christian life? I'll tell you how. As you received Christ, that's the way in which you should walk in him, just as you were taught, and not in these other ways. So that's Paul's thanksgiving, pretty big in setting up his argument. Let's look now at his prayer in 1:9-14, equally a very important part of this letter. So Paul prays that the Colossians would be filled with all knowledge, spiritual wisdom, and understanding. Now, do you think this word filled is important in the letter of Colossians? Oh yeah, big time, but we're going to get to that later. Notice how he stacks these wisdom words, wisdom, knowledge, understanding. And why do you think he did that? Probably because these false teachers in Colossae, they were claiming to be the wise ones. In chapter 2, verse 8, it says that they teach a philosophy. And then in verse 4, with plausible arguments. Ooh, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? But Paul says, no, let me show you where real wisdom is found. This is huge. Chapter 2, verse 3. In Jesus, in Messiah Jesus, are contained all the hidden treasures of wisdom and knowledge. You want to know where wisdom and knowledge and understanding is found? All the treasures of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding are in Messiah. So don't try to go beyond Messiah. You can't. You can't go beyond infinity. So this emphasis on wisdom is going to come back a few more times in this letter. In chapter 3, it says that they are being renewed in knowledge after the image of Christ. And then the very last exhortation in the whole book is that the Colossians would walk in wisdom. So Paul prays that they would be filled with wisdom in order that they would walk in a manner worthy. And what does that look like? Well, Paul tells us, fortunately. What does it look like to walk in a manner that's worthy? Well, you bearing fruit, and giving thanks to the Father. Now, there's a unique emphasis in the letter of Colossians on thanksgiving. Look how it returns again here in chapter 3 and then in chapter 4. And let me show you just how unique Paul's emphasis on thanksgiving in the book of Colossians is. Look at this. Let's compare Colossians to a few other letters in the New Testament. So this is just a simple search of the English translations for the word thank in the Bible. And let's scroll down here. These are all of the occurrences of the word, the English translation thank. So with these longer letters, Romans, Corinthians, I mean, it's going to show up 6, 7, 8 times. But in the shorter letters, it's only going to show up a couple times, 2, 3, 4 times, except the letter of Colossians. 7 times in Colossians. That's as many as some of these other longer letters. I wonder why. Well, think about what Paul's trying to do with this letter. If someone gives you a gift, the gospel, that they give you a gift, is the proper response when someone gives you the gift, imagine it's Christmas and you unwrap a present, is the proper response to say, well, this is not good enough. Let me add this here and add this other thing here. And okay, there you go. Now your gift is good enough for me. No, the proper response is thankfulness. I think that's why Paul is pushing into this thankfulness theme here in Colossians. Don't add anything to the gift that you were given. So what does Paul say here in this prayer that they should be thankful for? Well, a couple of things. One, that they were qualified to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. Now, the inheritance, this is referring to the Jewish inheritance of the Messianic kingdom, right? That's the inheritance that Paul is talking about. You've been qualified to share in that inheritance. You should be thankful for that. He's saying that you do not need to be circumcised or to keep the law of Moses in order to share in the inheritance of the Messianic kingdom in Israel, for you have already been qualified to share in that kingdom. Maybe you were alienated once, but now you have been brought near. You've been reconciled. You've been qualified to enter into that kingdom, and it says that you've been transferred into that kingdom. What's the second thing you should be thankful for? You should be thankful, Paul says, that you've been delivered from the domain of darkness and have been transferred into the kingdom of his beloved Son. Now, what is this domain of darkness here in, I think it's 1:13? Well, it's the domain of these elemental spirits, of the rulers and the authorities, the spiritual powers. Christ triumphed over those powers. He is now their head. So you do not need to practice your spirituality in the way that they do in that domain of darkness. You've been transferred out of that domain. You are in the kingdom of his beloved Son. Isn't that awesome? I love that. That's going to lead Paul pretty naturally into this hymn of praise of the king of that kingdom. And this really, 1:15 to 20, this is the high point of the whole letter. It's everyone's favorite part in the letter of Colossians, and rightfully so. Let's look at the structure of this poem to the Messiah in 1:15 to 20. Now notice it's parallel structure where in the first half it says, he is the image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation. All things are created through him and for him in the first panel. In the second panel, notice the parallels, he is the head of the body, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may be preeminent. And God would reconcile all things through Messiah. So Jesus, our Messiah, he is the agent both of creation, isn't that amazing, and of new creation. But what's a poem like that doing here? What's its function and its purpose in this argument of the book of Colossians? Well, I love what a scholar named William Lucas says. Let's look at this. All right, Lucas, what do you have for us? Let's look at this little commentary here, is what he says on verse 17. He's going to compare the letter of Colossians to the letter of Hebrews. And he says that the letter of Hebrews was just one long appeal for the church not to return to the shadow land. Remember, the Torah is a shadow, but the substance is in Christ. And the strategy of the author of Hebrews is the same strategy as Paul's here in this letter. And what is that strategy? It is a comprehensive exposition of the all-sufficient greatness of Jesus Messiah. That is his strategy. That is what this poem is all about. This poem is a poem about the greatness of Messiah. And if we spend our time contemplating how amazing our Messiah is, how great he is, well, we're going to think twice before we try to add anything to Messiah. After all, it says here in 1:19 that all the fullness of God dwells in him, which is just like 2:9 and 10. All the fullness of deity dwells in him bodily. Now, there's one more element I want to highlight here in this poem before we move on to our next section. So this poem, it functions as Jesus's credentials, his resume, his right to rule the cosmos is defined and defended here in this poem. He has no competitors for the throne, zero competitors. The elemental spirits, they're nothing next to him. He triumphed over them, first off, in the cross, but he also was the one who created them. It says that he created all things, visible and invisible. And those invisible things, those are the elemental spirits. Let me show you that. So let's take a look at that poem, chapter 1. So Jesus was the one who, by him, through him, created all things in heaven, spiritual things, and on earth, visible and invisible. What are those invisible things? Thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. And this little couplet, rulers and authorities, is what Paul is going to emphasize here. Rulers and authorities in chapter 2, rulers and authorities, when he's refuting the Colossian heresy. Well, let's jump now into Paul's, since we already took a look at this, let's look at Paul's explanation of his role as an apostle of the mystery. So the mystery, what is the mystery? It is the open secret. I like that little translation of the mystery. It is an open secret, something that was hidden but is now revealed. And what is the mystery? The mystery is Messiah in you, the hope of glory. And this, what he's talking about, is our union with Christ. We have been joined to Jesus. And this union with Messiah, it was God's means of reconciling God to man, but also of reconciling men to one another. This is, and specifically, I believe what he's talking about is reconciling Jew and Gentile. And this is the territory of Ephesians 2, isn't it? In his body of flesh, he tore down the dividing wall of hostility. And look then how he emphasizes this in chapter 3, where he says that in Messiah, there is no Jew or Gentile. Look at this. We're kind of jumping around a little bit, trying to follow the key themes. So here there is not Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, but Messiah is all, and Messiah is in all. So both Gentiles, they receive an inheritance in the kingdom alongside Jews. And their qualifications for entering the kingdom are not whether they've been circumcised or not, whether they keep the law of Moses, but only whether they are in Messiah. You want to come into the kingdom? The only question you have to answer is, are you in Messiah? So let's look now. Let's transition to Paul's alternative. We know we're not supposed to do our Christian life in this way, self-made, man-made religion, how are we to walk the Christian life? Well, our lives have been joined to the Messiah. That means that we died with him and we have been raised with him. And this is really some deep theology, but I love it. I think it's so important. So if our lives have been joined to Messiah, Paul says that we must set our minds, we are to orient our whole life to where our true life is. And where is our true life? Is it here on earth? No, it is above. It is where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Look at how he develops this argument in chapter 3. Okay, top of 3. For you have died, and where is your life? I ask you, where's your life? Your life is hidden with Messiah in God, at his right hand. And when Messiah, who is your life, my life is up there. When Messiah appears at his second coming, then my life will appear also with him in glory. So Paul is calling the Colossians to live in the present as if that future new creation has already arrived. He's calling them to be today the kinds of humans that they will one day become. Therefore, he can say, put off the old self, put off the old creation, and put on the new creation, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of your Creator. And we know, thanks to this wonderful poem here in chapter 1, that our Creator is Jesus, and we are being renewed, our new humanity is being renewed after his image. And Paul's going to get practical then in the second half of chapter 3 by explaining what it looks like for us to live the new creation life in our households, with the relationships between wives and husbands, children and fathers. And then this last one is very interesting in light of who is carrying the letter of Colossians: slaves and masters. Now, the letter of Colossians was carried to the church by Tychicus and Onesimus. And who's Onesimus again? Oh, yeah. He is the runaway slave of Philemon, who is an elder in the church in Colossae. I mean, that's kind of awkward, isn't it? So Paul, in his letters and in his ministry, he doesn't abolish the institution of slavery. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we study the letter of Philemon. But look what he does do. Look at these final greetings when he talks about Onesimus, that runaway slave. Scroll down to chapter 4 with me here. Look who he calls Onesimus. Onesimus, he is our faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. He is a beloved brother who's one of you. And then let's jump to the book of Philemon. And look how he describes, or look what he calls Philemon to do to his runaway slave. He says, perhaps this is why Onesimus was separated from you, Philemon, that you would have him back, not as a slave. This word bondservant means slave, not as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother. The call to live the new humanity, it is radical and it is world changing. And this makes sense, doesn't it? Because Jesus, he's the exalted king of the cosmos, the king of the world. And of course, he's Lord over Onesimus and Philemon. He is Lord over Jew and Gentile, who are made one in Messiah. In Messiah, all treasures of wisdom and knowledge are housed, and all the fullness of deity, it dwells inside of Jesus bodily, and we have been filled in him. And what could you add to that?